Good afternoon. We are beginning the second day of the conference dedicated to the Decoloniality and the Biennials, and it's the final fourth part of the public program of the Ukrainian Pavilion. My name is Tetyana Filevska. I'm creative director of the Ukrainian Institute and co-curator of the public program. For those who are with us in person in Venice, we just saw a beautiful film by an Indian artist, Ohida Kandahar, who is a visual artist and a filmmaker living between Kolkata and Delhi. And she is working a lot with her the vicinity, like personal memory, marginalized voices, collective trauma, and also non-linear stories interacting with various cultural layers of society. And her film, Dream Your Museum, was part of the Berlin Biennial this year, which was fully dedicated to the issue of decoloniality. Unfortunately, because of the copyright reasons, this part, the film, was not available for online stream, and unfortunately our online guests and online viewers cannot share that experience with us, but we will refer to the film and use it in our further discussion. Today's work will have two parts. For the two parts, it will be a lecture and a following discussion. And this part will wrap up the program, which lasted from April throughout the whole duration of the biennial. And now I would like to invite on this stage our next speaker, the lecturer, Hanna Rudyk, who is a Ukrainian museum curator and educator. She has been working in the Khanenko Museum in Kyiv for the past 20 years. Hanna is a curator of Islamic collection at the Kyiv Kyiv Museum and is currently hosted by the Technical University of Berlin and supported by Alexander von Humboldt Foundation for her research project on decolonization of European museums of Islamic and Asian art, concepts and practices. And today, Hanna will introduce her lecture about the history behind the Russian Pavilion at the Venice Biennial, titled Russian Pavilion in Venice, the Khanenko Gambit. Hanna, please, the floor is yours, the mic is yours.
Thank you very much, Tetyana, for your generous intro. Thank you very much personally and the Ukrainian Institute for this so important, so essential program on decoloniality and decolonization. Dear esteemed friends and colleagues, I would like to bring to your attention today one of the key histories behind the pavilions for us Ukrainians. Outside this history, we can no longer think on the connections between Ukraine and the Venice Biennale. This is a story about the Russian pavilion built at the expense of the prominent Ukrainian Kulturträger, Bogdan Khanenko. I have not found in Ukraine archival materials on this event. There is no doubt that some documents were in the Khanenko's archive, but this archive disappeared without a trace a week after Varvara Khanenko's death in May 1922. The most part of the documents on the pavilion are in Russia. In 2014, one of the Russian museums published selected letters and other materials on the pavilion from state and private archives. So we know the factual framework of the story. In short, in 1913, Bogdan Khanenko, listed in Russian publication as a Russian industrialist and philanthropist, a honorary member of the Imperial Academy of Arts, offered the honorary president of the mentioned academy, Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna, a donation in the amount of 31,000 rubles for the development of the project, construction, furnishing, and further maintenance of the Russian pavilion in Venice. The donation was gratefully accepted, and the pavilion, designed by Alexei Shusiev, was opened in 1914. Most interesting questions for me in this story are why and what for? Why and what for Bogdan Khanenko, one of the key drivers of the cultural development of Kyiv and Ukraine at the end of the 19th, first decades of the 20th century, why and what for did he voluntarily pay for the creation of the Russian pavilion for the Venice Biennale? For all the impressive breadth of the Khanenko's interests as art connoisseurs and collectors, they were not particularly interested in modern art, which was then contemporary art. What prompted them to offer this donation? Today I will consider this question within the broader context of the cultural and political situation in the sub-Russian Kyiv, and from the point of view of the personal Kulturträgers strategy of the Khanenkos. But let me start with a very basic question of who were Bogdan and Varvara Khanenko. I can't switch it ahead. Can I? Please, staff, technical assistants, could you help me? Oh, yes, finally. Okay. Bogdan Khanenko was a descendant of an old and well-known Ukrainian Cossack family, which in the first half of the 17th century received noble privileges from the Polish king Jan II Kazimierz Vasa. Bogdan's ancestor, Mikhail Khanenko, was a hetman of the right bank Ukraine in the 17th century, and a well-known politician and historian was Mykola Khanenko, the general Horunji of the Zaporozhian army and a famous memorist of the 18th century. Bogdan's uncles, Mikhail and Alexander Khanenko, were active public figures, intellectuals, and collectors of Ukrainian antiquities. So Bogdan's childhood in the family estate in Chernigiv region was spent among educated and socially active people keen in the Ukrainian theme. After graduating from the law faculty of Moscow University, Khanenko started his juridical career in St. Petersburg. It was there and then, as he later recalled in his memories, quote, that my vocation was determined. I irrevocably decided to study old painting and collect works of it, end quote. In summer 1874, Bogdan Khanenko married Varvara Tereshchenko. She was the elder daughter of Nikola Tereshchenko, an emerging sugar tycoon of Ukraine. Extremely successful businessmen, the Tereshchenkos became new nobility in 1870 due to Nikola's generous philanthropic projects. Striving for the public good, read the motto on their coat of arms. In the era of rising social and national awareness of the Ukrainian elite, the Tereshchenkos were among the leaders of this movement. Seeking to adopt aristocratic style of life, Nikola and other members of the family started collecting art. So Varvara was surrounded not just by nouveau riches, but also new passionate amateurs and patrons of art. Along with love for arts, she absorbed the Tereshchenkos' inherent traditions of charity. These two predispositions, her sensitivity to art and to charity, had key impact upon her life path and shaped their common with Bogdan Khanenko future museum vision and action. From 1880s on, the Khanenkos were actively collecting arts and antiquities. Vienna, Berlin, Paris, Madrid, Warsaw, Rome, Florence, Harbin, and Cairo were by no means complete geographies of their exploratory travels and their correspondence with the European leading art connoisseurs. Cornelis Hofstede de Groot, Abraham Bredius, Wilhelm von Bode, Max Jacob Friedlander, these and other key Western art historians were their consultants. In his letter of 1897, Bogdan Khanenko tells about his contact with Wilhelm von Bode, a #1 German art historian called Bismarck of German museums. Quote, J'étais à Berlin, j'ai présenté à M. Bode 2 tableaux attribués à Rembrandt. Après les avoir bien examinés, il les attribua au maître lui-même, end quote. I've been to Berlin and I presented to Mr. Bode 2 of my paintings by Rembrandt, attributed to Rembrandt, and after he had examined them well, he had attributed them to the master himself. The Khanenko's collection began with European fine art, however, sensitively following the new trends of both intellectual fashion and the art market, in the first decade of the 20th century, the Khanenkos had a classical Western universal art collection. In addition to the European art and that of classical antiquity, it included archaeology of ancient Egypt, rare pieces of pre-Islamic and medieval Persian art, artistic treasures of Byzantium and Ottoman Turkey, European and Asian historical arms and armor, as well as applied art, collections of art from Japan, China, India, and other Asian cultures. The thoroughness and breadth of their interest in the history of world art is evidenced by the impressive collection of books on art history of about 3,000 volumes, up to now preserved in the Khanenko Museum. The Khanenko's decision to settle in Kyiv for permanent residence was and is of crucial importance to Ukraine. True citizens of Europe, they traveled more than stayed in Kyiv, having their own apartments in both Russian capitals and numerous estates. But they chose Kyiv as their home. That meant, first of all, the home of their art collection. These two, Nikola Tereshchenko, actually Varvara's father, played a decisive role in this epoch-making decision. He and his family made exactly the same choice for Kyiv in the mid-1870s after a short stay in Moscow. And it was Nikola who in 1875 purchased 2 plots of land in the New Cart Street opposite the university and built on one of them an elegant mansion that he later gave to his daughter Varvara and his son-in-law. This is how the Khanenko's mansion looked initially before reconstruction, redoing it in 1891. So at the end of the 1880s, the Khanenkos moved to Kyiv, where they joined the community of intellectuals, art lovers, and philanthropists. Their collection expanded soon with a new section on Ukraine. Their interest in archaeology and generous funding of excavations allowed them to eventually make up an archaeological collection, unique in its value and completeness. The collection included artifacts found in Ukraine and dating from the Stone Age to the Scythian era and to the era of Great Migration, up to the period of Slavic settlement in the Dnipro region, including first centuries of Christianity. There were also objects from the Greek colonies of the Black Sea coast. In 1890s, collections of old Ukrainian icons and the so-called Cossack antiquities from the 15th century to 18th century, the period prior to Russian domination of Central and Eastern Ukraine, entered the Khanenko's collection. At the beginning of the 20th century, the division of Ukrainica was further replenished with a large and diverse collection of Ukrainian folk art and traditional household items. In 1896, Bogdan Khanenko headed the board of the Tereshchenko brothers' Sugar and Refinery Company, a large industrial syndicate with tens of millions of turnover and huge surplus profits. Actually, it was then that the Khanenkos became really wealthy people. Their capabilities as collectors and patrons reached a new level. The first decade of their Kyiv period was also a time of their evolution from art amateurs and private collectors to leading builders of public culture in Kyiv. It is important to remind that the last decades of the 19th century was a difficult time for Ukrainian culture. Imperial authorities, afraid of Ukrainian separatism, harshly suppressed any sprouts of national development. Book printing in Ukrainian was banned, as well as Ukrainian press and Ukrainian theater. Despite the growing interest in national history and culture among the Ukrainian social elite, until the very end of the 19th century, there was no public museum in Kyiv. And to the appeal of Ukrainian intellectuals and philanthropists, the imperial bodies responded, I quote, "There is no need for such an institution," end of quote. For the empire, Kyiv was and should have continued to remain a provincial colonial city, a land without its own memory, its own identity, and its own narrative. In 1897, Bogdan Khanenko in fact headed the newly created Kyiv Society for Antiquities and Arts, the purpose of which was to organize a city public museum. Khanenko managed to obtain personal permission for the museum from the Emperor of Russia, Nikolai II. During the visit of the imperial family to Kiev, Khanenko organized an inspection by the emperor, the empress, and the Grand Duke of the site of the future museum. Also, as a leader of the project, he received a donation from the state treasury in the amount of 100,000 rubles for the construction of the building. And here you see the building that was constructed. In total, Khanenko raised about 250,000 rubles for the erection and furnishing of the museum building. In addition, he encouraged key Ukrainian antiquities collectors to donate objects to the museum. The Tereshchenkos bought then a unique archaeological collection made up by the leading Kiev archaeologist, Czech by origin, Vikenty Khvoyka. All in all, the donated collections were estimated in 140,000 rubles, and the Khanenkos only themselves donated 3,145 items of Ukrainian archaeology worth about 71,000 rubles. These all figures testify to the scale of the museum movement in Ukraine at the turn of the century, as well as to the extraordinary intellectual, moral, and organizational skills and moral devotion of Bogdan Khanenko. On this old photo from the National Art Museum of Ukraine's archive, you can see the first exhibition of Ukrainian archaeology, opened in the newly built City Museum yet in 1899 for the 11th All-Russian Archaeological Summit in Kiev, also organized by Bogdan Khanenko. These collections were donated to the museum by the Khanenkos and the Tereshchenkos. Varvara Khanenko had her personal share of contribution to the first museum. At the beginning of the 20th century, she became an activist of the Ukrainian handicraft movement, inspired by the European arts and crafts movement, and called by the idea of preserving and developing the traditions of Ukrainian folk art. In 1904, in her estate Olenivka in Kyiv region, she founded a college and a manufacturer for traditional Ukrainian carpet weaving and fabric printing, where she invited Vasil Krychevsky, a Ukrainian modernist artist and a deep connoisseur of folk traditions, as an instructor. Besides, she enthusiastically studied herself and collected works of traditional art, carpets, embroidery, clothes, ceramics, and tempered glass. And in 1906, she participated with her collection in the first ever exhibition of Ukrainian folk art in the first City Museum. Here on this photo from the archive of the National Museum of Ukrainian Folk and Decorative Art, you can see Varvara Khanenko as we think this is Varvara Khanenko. Sitting to the far left among other organizers of the folk art exhibition, including well-known collectors, researchers, and educators as Olena Pchilka, Vasil Krychevsky, Mykola Belashivsky, Vadim Shcherbakivsky, Vikenty Khvoyka, Kost Moshchenko. Over the next several years, Varvara Khanenko donated about 1,200 items of folk art and ethnography to the first museum collection. And here, most of these objects donated by her are kept today by the National Museum of Folk and Decorative Art in Kyiv. For instance, this beautiful Poltava regional carpet of the 19th century. It is important to emphasize now the fact that Varvara Khanenko's active role in the creation of the first city museum was only recently reconstructed, still very fragmentarily. As everywhere else in the Russian Empire, essentially male-centric modern culture, and particularly its culture of memory, had prioritized men, relegating women to the margins of just outside the framework of official history. Therefore, Varvara Khanenko is so conspicuously absent in the official history of the Venice Pavilion. Today, thanks to the painstaking archival research of the last decade, we have every reason to talk about the collection, the ideas, and the decisions, not of Khanenko, but of the Khanenkos. To sum up the story about the Khanenkos' immense intellectual, moral, and material contribution into Ukrainian cultural heritage, I will just say that today 5 key national museums of Kyiv, that is, besides the Khanenko Museum. You see all them on the slide. key parts of the former Khanenko's collection, and until 24th of February this year, they presented their shares at the key areas of their permanent displays. Most of these museums were created already in the Soviet period as a result of division of the first city museum holdings. So, the first public museum in Kyiv was officially opened and consecrated in December 1904, and please pay attention to its full name: Sovereign Emperor Nikolai Alexandrovich Art, Industrial and Scientific Museum. The goal that Ukrainian elite failed to achieve in 1880s was achieved by Bogdan Khanenko, a member of the Imperial Archaeological Commission, a corresponding member of the Moscow Imperial Archaeological Society, a honorary member of the Imperial Academy of Arts, since 1906 a member of the State Council of Russia from industrialists, a member of the right-centered pro-monarchist party of the Octobrists, since 1908 an actual state councillor of the Russian Empire, and sometimes in those years he also became a member of the St. Petersburg Freemasons Lodge of the Interparliamentary Union. Khanenko's affiliation with countless imperial political and public structures and communities, his personal direct contacts with the imperial family, initiated and supported by him at every opportunity. The members of imperial family were listed as honorary members of all commissions and committees that were headed by Khanenko. And finally, the long and awkward official name of the first city museum honoring the sovereign emperor, the name that Khanenko insisted on. All this systematic and articulated loyalty to the empire was, in my opinion, a rationally constructed strategy. In all these official roles in Moscow and Petersburg, according to the recent archival research data, he did almost nothing. Say, during the years of being a member of the State Council of Russia, he only once brought up some minor issue for discussion. There is no information about his activities as a member of the Octobrist Party or as a Freemason. It looks that in all these communities, Khanenko was just visibly and sometimes financially present, while he was actively present in Kyiv, investing here or there in Kyiv his lifetime, his knowledge, and his energy. It is not by chance that Moscow authors named him in a book Russian industrialist and philanthropist. The official imperial archives could clearly testify precisely to this identity of Khanenko. This double identity, or rather this second constructed pro-imperial identity of Khanenko, provided him with the necessary resource of trust of the highest imperial officials, and consequently with the necessary degree of freedom, allowing him to make important changes in Kyiv. Proofs that Khanenko's pro-imperial identity was a mask rather than sincere servility can be found in his letters to Hvedir Volk, or Theodore Volkov, an eminent Ukrainian archaeologist and anthropologist, a member of all Kyiv community, Starokyivska Hromada. Like other members of Hromada community, Volk was persecuted for his Ukrainophile activities and was forced to emigrate to France. Bogdan Khanenko's letters, preserved in the archive of the Institute of Archaeology in Kyiv, mostly deal with very specific issues of Ukrainian history and archaeology. In one of these letters of 1900, Khanenko wrote to Volk about the rich treasure of the Grand Prince's era, found in Kyiv shortly before that, and consisting of golden objects decorated with enamels. I quote, "Regarding the treasure found in Kyiv, I have sent to your disposition photos of the main items. It is premature and dangerous to announce a new find in Russia, as they can claim it to St. Petersburg. That happened." End of quote. The extraction of cultural heritage was a common practice in the Russian Empire. The most valuable art and history objects found in different sites were claimed and seized by Hermitage, the main museum of the metropolis. Khanenko, like other Ukrainian collectors, consciously and covertly resisted this colonial policy, keeping Ukrainian heritage in Ukraine. Khanenko's dual identity seemingly fits into the concept of colonial mimicry, coined by post-colonial Indian American thinker Homi Bhabha in his famous essay of Mimicry and Man. Bhabha considers mimicry as a constant and unconscious attempt of a colonized to imitate a colonizer. This, I quote, being the same but not quite, end quote, finally becomes a tool of subversion in normative discourse and disrupting the authority of a dominant. However, Khanenko, as it looks, imitated loyalty consciously, very pragmatically. Imitation was a key tool of his well-calculated strategy. A man of sharp, insightful mind, rational to the core. In my opinion, the common truism about Khanenko the romantic is completely pointless. He thoroughly studied the rules of the empire and brilliantly played by them. Anticipating and surpassing expectations, he presented to the empire a figure of its sweetest dream, a perfect subject, the ideal little Russian, impeccably benevolent and delightfully sensitive to the subtlest nuances of imperial desire. One of these nuances was the hierarchy of museums. Museums of world history and world art that were museums that shaped and shared big global narratives could exist only in the capitals, in Moscow and St. Petersburg. The centers of the provinces were also allowed to have museums, although, as we know, not all of them. But these provincial museums were supposed to be museums of local content, local art, local history, local nature. These important political principles, the knowledge of which I thankfully owe to the Ukrainian museum historian Mykola Mykolaievich Bielashivsky, who is, by the way, a grandson of the Khanenko's companion, the director of the first Kiev museum, famous archaeologist and art historian Mykola Fedotovich Bielashivsky. This principle could explain why, in his keynote speech at the opening of the museum, Khanenko suddenly mentions collections of soils, minerals, metals, which in fact were not in that museum. With this imaginary, naturalistic aspect of the new created museum, Khanenko presumably camouflaged its too obvious Ukrainian history focus, as the text of speech was intended for publication. So the new Kiev Museum would perform or fit into the narrow frame of what was allowed for a province. As said, this strategy of conscious mimicry proved to be efficient. It allowed Khanenko to do what no one else could do before him. But of course, not all of the Khanenko's contemporaries understood and supported him. In the context of the Khanenko's strategic dual identity in relations with the empire, Bogdan's voluntary offer to sponsor the Russian pavilion for the Venice Biennale looks very logical. The situation by 1913 turned out to be very favorable, including the resounding success of Diaghilev in Venice in 1907, followed by the visit of the Russian Emperor in 1909, the ongoing parades of pavilions, and the ardent desire of the august patroness of the Imperial Academy of Arts to implement the idea of the pavilion, for which she had already chosen a plot of land in Venice. And on the other hand, the lack of funds and the self-humiliating rejection of the idea by the Academy Board in 1912. All these circumstances shaped the momentum for Khanenko to step onto the stage. In January 1913, he wrote a letter to Grand Duchess. Yes. Your Imperial Highness, respectfully bowing to your untiring and heartfelt service to Russian art and endeavoring to come to the assistance of your energetic activities, and so on, I came to the decision to place at your disposal, not to the disposal of the Imperial Academy of Arts, but at your disposal of 21,000 plus 10,000 rubles as capital and so on, your Imperial Highness, most royal servant Bogdan Khanenko. He was then immediately invited to a highest audience, and the matter was quickly settled. It is interesting that Khanenko's pragmatism in the case of the pavilion was obvious to Shchusev, the architect of the pavilion. In a letter to Fyodor Berenstein, the pavilion project manager, Shusif bitterly complains about Khanenko's refusal to allocate additional funds beyond the promised contribution. I quote, "It is difficult to beat Khanenko, but if you promise him a Hofmeister, he will give another 5 or 6 or even 30,000. The high civil rank of Hofmeister entails significant privileges. Being awarded this title was equal to a high imperial award and was a sign of special personal favor of the royal family. According to my vision, to our vision, the favor of August family was the main strategic resource for the Khanenkos. Therefore, when in his next letter to Khanenko, Shusif, as he himself later recalled, resorted to direct blackmail and threatened Khanenko to complain to the Grand Duchess, the tone of Ukrainian patron changed. Khanenko apologized and promised Shusif to give additional money. What did the Khanenkos plan to get from the empire for the price of this showy gift? For what new achievements did they so diligently strengthen the ground of trust in relation with ruling bodies? Why and what for was this new degree of freedom needed? My answer to this is for the Khanenko Museum in Kyiv. In 1913, the year of the donation to the pavilion, the Khanenkos already knew that they would leave their priceless world art collection on Tereshchenkovska Street and that a new world art museum would be created in their exquisite mansion designed as a Venetian palazzo of the 18th century. The Museum of World Art in Kyiv, a museum of the type which only the metropolis had the right to have. The museum which was to become a symbol and the means of overcoming Kyiv's status of a cultural colony. The new achievement of covert cultural revolution in Kyiv carried out by the Khanenkos. It required a particular credit of trust from the imperial authorities, personal trust backed by personal affection, and the pavilion was supposed to establish this trust and to ensure this affection. At the end of the 1913, in the Magazine of Art of Southern Russia, in the Chronicle section, a short announcement appeared, and it was the first public announcement of the idea. VN and BI Khanenko are going to establish an art museum of their name, for which they are going to redo their house and rearrange their painting and objects of applied art in it, after which the museum will be bequeathed to Kyiv, and it will be maintained within the funds assumed from the special income house of donors. This is how the Khanenkos mentioned the Khanenko's private art gallery, presenting one of the richest encyclopedic private collection of art on the territory of the whole Russian Empire of that period, looked in 1910s when the pavilion was founded and the announcement was made. Just to have another view, another hall. The Khanenko Museum was established, although Bogdan Khanenko didn't live to see its opening. The museum was born in 1919 in the difficult times of the previous Russian war in Ukraine. It was due to the personal strong will and faith of Varvara Khanenko, a lonely elderly woman who stayed in Kyiv to preserve the priceless cultural heritage in Ukraine and for Ukraine, when almost all her relatives and friends left for safety abroad. The Khanenko Museum in Kyiv concentrated the ultimate sense of her and Bogdan's lives. It brought together everything for which they lived: history and art of the world, knowledge and enlightenment, humanism and nobility of spirit, and the flourishing of culture in their native land. And the Russian Pavilion in Venice was a timely tool to implement this ultimate sense. I believe that this topic will be further explored in depth and breadth. New documents will be found, studied, published, and discussed, which will support or undermine the proposed vision of the pavilion as a gambit of the Khanenkos, a term that in chess means a tactic sacrifice made to gain some important strategic advantage. Pavilion was the Khanenko's Gambit in their strategy of cultural resistance to the empire. These two buildings, so intimately interconnected within the personal history of the Khanenkos, the history of apparent loyalty and actual resistance, of hybrid identity and strategy of Ukrainian colonial subject, these two buildings are today even more tightly connected within the same history of imperialism. Both of them are physically empty now. Russia and its culture are today in the ultimate crisis of sense, run out of words and representations. And the Russian pavilion, twice forcefully seized by the succeeding quasi-empires, the Soviet Union and then the Russian Federation, cannot but be perceived today as a symbol of violence and narcissism, of imperialism, this heavy trauma of human civilization, a trauma that continues to deepen today. And the Khanenko Museum, so beautiful, so full of life, and so vibrantly senseful. It had to empty its halls on February 24th, 2022. And on October 10th, 2022, the museum was physically injured as a result of a Russian missile strike that hit kids' playground located 50 meters from the historical Khanenko's mansion. Windows shattered, skylights fell down, cutting old museum parquet. 100 and a few years ago, Varvara Khanenko stayed in Kyiv in the wartime to implement ultimate human sense. This year, my colleagues, 95% women, choose to stay in Kyiv under shelling to save and protect this ultimate sense. This museum today stands as one of many symbols of Ukraine and of unquenchable faith in good future. The future of freedom, the future of justice, the future of humanness. And I think that for the sake of this future, for the sake of healing the countless injuries inflicted on humanity by empires and imperialism, a healing so much sought today by societies throughout the world, a project of the Khanenko Museum and other museums of Ukraine, in collaboration with contemporary artists, a project rethinking the past, reinventing the present, and reimagining the future should be planned in the space of the Russian Pavilion in Venice, as a part of the next international art and architecture exhibition of La Biennale di Venezia. Thank you for your kindest attention.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Hanna. It's really hard to take your breath and keep your tears when you actually see the result of the many lives and efforts being ruined in seconds. We will continue this conversation into the discussion, which is titled The Future of the Pavilions, and where we'll get into a few more cases on the particular pavilions at the Venice Biennale, La Biennale di Venezia. And as we started discussing yesterday, the future of the biennials might be without the national pavilions, but they are still there, and we have to deal with them. There are different questions about them. So I would like to invite to come to the stage the other three speakers, and I would like to ask them come on the stage, and then we'll introduce in details each of you. Please come, Lucia Gavulova. Lizaveta German and Linda Kaljundi. I will introduce everyone. Yeah, well, please join us. Linda Kaljundi is a professor of cultural history at the Estonian Academy of Arts and a senior researcher fellow at the Tallinn University. She works with the Baltic history and cultural memory studies, post-colonialism and environmental humanities. Linda has published articles and edited volumes on modern, pre-modern, human, non-human history. And she has also worked as part of the team on the Estonian Pavilion at the 59th Biennale di Venezia. Lizaveta German is a PhD, curator and art historian, co-founder of the Naked Room, which is a gallery in Kiev. She is a co-curator of the Ukrainian Pavilion at the 59th Biennale di Venezia. Please welcome our speakers, and Hanna Rudyk is joining us as well in this discussion. Before we start the discussion, I would like to ask the speakers to introduce their topics, their background related to the title of the discussion, and make their statements. And I would like to invite Linda first. If you wish, you can just sit, or if you wish, you can stand. The slides, yeah, sure. Yeah.
Yes, first of all, Tetyana, thank you so much for the invitation. I feel so glad and also extremely honored to be here and to take part in this event and these discussions. And thank you also, Hanna, for this very thought-provoking talk before our discussion. So with the people who we are here, we actually had a visit to the Estonian Pavilion this morning. And as I already said, the Estonian Pavilion, that is in this year located in the Dutch Pavilion in Giardini, in many ways provides us almost like a too ideal case for decolonizing the Biennale, because it is a small Eastern European nation suddenly located in the very center of the Venice Biennale, and with a project that directly addresses Dutch colonial history. So the Estonian Pavilion this year departs from the forgotten botanical illustrations of Emilia Rosalia Saal, who, thanks to her marriage to an Estonian-born Dutch colonial official in the Dutch Indies, was able to fulfill her career as a botanical illustrator in what is nowadays Indonesia. So in many ways, it is a very multi-layer project that tells different stories about decolonization. And so I would like to highlight that perhaps it also shows that decolonization always has many layers, and in different contexts it means different things. So also the relocation of the Estonian Pavilion to the Dutch Pavilion, it resonates differently in the Netherlands, here in Venice, but also in Estonia, or I would like to say in Eastern Europe as well, where this decolonization is only beginning, and where perhaps we have not been that used to telling the histories of decolonization or looking at our own histories from these decolonizing perspectives. Also perhaps because if here on the black and white image you see Emilia and Andres Saal, the protagonists of the Estonian Pavilion, in their mansion in Indonesia, then this is not how Estonians or Eastern Europeans normally would imagine themselves in the early 20th century. They would rather imagine themselves dwelling in a peasant farmhouse in the Estonian case. And just to contrast this, I would like to show you an image that is made of Estonians roughly 50 years ago, 50 years before the image was taken of Emilia and Andres Saal in their Indonesian home. So this is an image of an Estonian and Latvian that for me and my colleagues, has worked as a trigger for many other exhibitions where we have attempted to initiate research on the colonial connections in Estonian history, and also started to contemplate on how to decolonize our own collections. So this image that we were actually for a long time unable to locate, then we finally found out that it derives from a collection of the fauna of the Russian Empire, where it's these images of different indigenous peoples are shown hand in hand with the images of the Russian animals, plants, flora and fauna all together. So, and on the one hand, I think it really shows that you have to start with your own collections. So the image came from the Estonian History Museum, where it was located. But on the other hand, it also showed immediately the problematics of dealing with that kind of materials. How do you handle the titles, the changing of the titles, the renaming of such works? Or in the first place, how do you re-represent that kind of works without not recreating, re-representing the hierarchies, inequalities behind the creation of such works as this one is. So together with my colleagues, just to introduce my background to this discussion a bit, at the Art Museum in Tallinn, Estonia, we have initiated 2 exhibitions. The first, The Conqueror's High, a few years ago, and now this year, Arts of Science, where we have namely thought to decolonize Estonian museum collections and looking at the ethnographic images available, but then also at different scientific illustrations. So also to look at hand in hand the representation of peoples, but also the representation of environments in the Estonian collections, and at the same time thinking what would be the value of revisiting the Estonian collections for rethinking colonial imperial history of Russia, but not from the perspective of the Russian imperial centers, but rather from the Baltic perspective. So I think it's very important also not to reproduce these hierarchies while reworking the collections, right? And obviously the working with the history of Russian colonialism, one has to face the situation that there is nearly not as much as, or there is very little research literature available on that topic due to the long-standing Soviet tradition of not handling Russian history as parts of global colonial history. And that also has deeply influenced the Estonian research tradition, where there is also very meager research on the colonial aspects of Estonian collections and the ways in which it has been implicated by the Russian colonial imperial history. So in many ways, we were lucky to collaborate, initiate our decolonizing projects in cooperation with Lizaveta in Pursuit of Venus, which was shown here at the Venice Biennale in 2017 in the New Zealand Pavilion, and that offered a decolonizing perspective on the colonial representations of the colonization of New Zealand and Australia. So I think it's also very fruitful to put the decolonizing of the Eastern European collections in dialogue with different parts of the global colonial history as the Estonian Pavilion. And just to show briefly some examples of materials we have been dealing with, again, like here are the Enlightenment period collections from Estonia, but created within the Russian imperial colonial expansion to the peripheries of the empire. Again, here it has been fruitful to look at hand in hand the ways in which the empire represents the peoples of the Russian Empire, alongside with mapping the natural resources of the empire. But again, the same questions arise: how to deal with that kind of material without not reproducing the hierarchies, how to recontextualize, also how to choose new titles, new framings, explanations for those works. then also working from a long perspective, looking at the longevity of these imperial stereotypes also in the late 19th century, where thinking about the Enlightenment period, colonial imperial images, how in the late 19th century they work hand in hand, are combined with the rise of nationalism in the empire, the fascination towards ethnographic imageries, and the ways in which then they are to some extent already being used by nationalist movements, but then nevertheless at the same time also appropriated, used by the Russian Empire for this ongoing display of the ethnographic wealth and diversity and richness of the empire as it is perceived from the imperial centers or reproduced. And perhaps also one of the keywords that we have been emphasizing here during the last 2 days is also to decolonize one's own identities, to realize that here you see these Estonian maidens in a folk dress, in a painting that was created by a Baltic German artist living in Estonia for an imperial palace in St. Petersburg. And while doing the image, he was leaning on Italian examples of similar academic paintings, idealizing the folk culture. So it's a very multi-layered background from where these kind of imagery symbols are created. And while working with these kind of representations in Estonia, one also has to acknowledge that, yes, indeed, these kind of maidens in folk dresses you come across the moment your plane lands at Tallinn Airport. They're still very much in the center of how national identity is represented. So to be aware of its multinational, but also very imperial colonial layers. And just to wrap up, I'd like again to highlight perhaps this complexities, diversities of the Russian colonial history that we come across in collections such as the Estonian collection. So the previous examples mostly related to what has been labeled the internal colonization of the imperial mainland, or the imperial expansion to its peripheries along as it extends as borders of the empire. But then Russian colonization also has much to do with the conquest of the overseas colonies, especially in the Pacific realm. And again, we see these combinations of this development of hand-in-hand of representing the indigenous peoples and their natural resources. So again, working hand-in-hand with the scientific illustration, but also with ethnographic illustration, and also acknowledging the multinational background of this Russian colonial expansion that also relied to a large extent on the Baltic German scientists as well as explorers and navigators. And also with this respect, we can again relate this to decolonizing Estonian identity again, because here is on the black and white image, you see an influential vision of Estonian image from the 1970s, when along with this rustic ethnographic turn that was influential across Eastern Europe at that time, that many of the leading artists, writers, filmmakers reconnected Estonian identity, namely with these indigenous peoples, emphasizing their close ties to nature, and thereby the Estonian sort of roots going back to these indigenous peoples, abandoning largely these ethnographic imageries of maidens in folk dresses that I showed you before, but also in the case of this kind of reforging the Estonian identity more towards what was perceived as more authentic, one also has to be aware that even images like these have a much earlier colonial background, also relating to the ways in which Russian imperialists, but also Baltic Germans have represented indigenous peoples, including Estonians, during their explorations and during the period of colonial expansion. Yeah. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Linda. There are plenty of layers, absolutely. And actually, during one of our previous conversations here in September, I think Madina Tlostanova told us that decoloniality doesn't have the kind of the final point, the final destination. It's just the way that you go through, and layer after layer, you just dismantle these powers of the structures of power. Thank you so much. And I would like to ask Lizaveta German to present her statement.
Can I have the slides? Can I have the slides, please? Thank you. While we're waiting for the slides, I would like to thank the speakers for also inspiring beginning of our discussion, and I'm happy that the notion of the museum and discussion of the museum is already there on the table, and I would like to make a little pre-announcement in relation to Museum Khanenko. The presentation was very touching and really very dramatic, and as a little bit of hope that I might bring to the table now is make this pre-announcement that actually now we are planning, and we're kind of in an active phase, though the circumstances are very complicated, of course, is to bring the Fountain of Exhaustion, which is now on view on the Venice, the Ukrainian Pavilion at Venice Biennale, to bring it to Khanenko Museum and to exhibit it there as an exhibition. We have a twin fountain, which was produced in Kiev, but couldn't be transported because of the war. So what we, see here in Venice is one edition, but there is another one, absolutely identical, and this is the part of the concept of the artist, that there can be a couple of them, a couple of fountains. And so the idea is to bring one to Kiev, which was planned to be happening in the end of this year, but due to shelling and to quite devastating consequences of it for the Khanenko Museum, we must postpone it, or we probably will postpone it to spring. But nevertheless, the brave Khanenko Museum team and the team of the Ukrainian Pavilion are doing actually a lot now to make it happen and to bring it to Kiev, and to give a little kind of beam of life and hope into the museum while it's waiting for its permanent collection to be back to the display. So my presentation today is called Anatomy of Scandal, Apocrypha of Ukrainian Pavilion at La Biennale di Venezia, and I don't want to repeat the history of Ukrainian presence, which was presented yesterday by my colleague Anastasia Platonova, but nor do I want actually to criticize or to go deep into conflicts or gossips or some misfortunes of organization of Ukrainian Pavilion within the past 20 years. What I want to do today is to pin up several points, let's say, issues which Ukrainian Pavilion has witnessed and has experienced within the past 20 years. And these points might be also the points to discuss with my colleagues, if they can relate to it, or how we can, as a national pavilion, someone who is responsible for the national pavilion, overcome this. And I pinned these points in relation to Venice Biennale specifically because for Ukrainian scene, I claim, this is my perhaps objective point, but I claim that the Venice Biennale was a certain, kind of a very precious special prize for Ukrainian community, and everyone was striving to get here to represent. And in my perspective, the presence of Ukrainian Pavilion was a kind of a substitute for many other things and achievements that could have been done in the local art scene. So it was also always kind of a replacement for something else which has to be done to develop the art scene, to develop the art process, and sometimes instead of really focusing the creative forces and managing forces to do something internally, it was perhaps
aimed at representing at Venice. So I will give just several examples of it. This is our presentation. Of course, I need to start with the Ukrainian Pavilion, which is happening right now. I won't be talking a lot about it, but when we were just in the beginning of the organizational process, we had an internal joke with my fellow curators, Boris Filonenko and Maria Lanko, and also with the rest of the team, that perhaps this pavilion might have a chance to be the first pavilion which is organized without a scandal in the background. And then the war started. So it's, okay, we don't have a scandal, but we would better have a scandal, of course, rather than what we're going through now. Nevertheless, we managed to present it, and I think this is the achievement of its own, of course. Actually, we have a very curious book by Ukrainian art critic, art journalist, Alexei Sidorgibelinda, who collected all the different facts about Ukrainian presence with different artists during the course of the 20th century, starting from some of these facts were presented by Anastasia yesterday about the presence of different Ukrainian artists and different iterations of the biennial, but actually I would like to pin the word of presence in the title. So the book is called 100 Years of Presence, and this is again the word which is very crucial here, because actually are we present? Yeah, so are we to illustrate my point, that to be present at the Venice Biennial for different creative teams in charge of Ukrainian Pavilion was the tool, the instrument to pinpoint Ukraine at the global map, and the Venice Biennial was perhaps one, if not the only one, in certain years to do that. So. What I would like to pinpoint here is this several aspects of what goals Ukrainian art community was trying to achieve by presenting Ukrainian Pavilion in different years at Venice Biennale. So historical bonds with 20th century art history, naturally, not naturally, but unnaturally, what I was going to say. The Ukrainian art history was embedded in the international art history as a part of something else, as a part of Soviet Union art history, the part of Russian art history, and only now we're actually facing this very urgent necessity to write our own art history. But again, as Sidorgibelinda points in his book, he's trying to actually show, and I think this is a very crucial aim of this book, to show that the Ukrainian artist was actually presented on many different biennials. Their presence was not very visible, perhaps. They didn't make any difference. They didn't pinpoint the Ukraine on the global art map, but nevertheless, they were present. And just to illustrate this, this is a beautiful painting, very interesting painting by Viktor Rzych, one of the artists who had this position between official and non-official art scene, he's basically what he's doing is that he is depicting his wife Galina Naledova, who, by the way, presented her works at the Venice Biennial in the 70s. She presented her paintings as a part of a Soviet Union pavilion. Here he kind of hides her a little bit, but at the same time he kind of marks her presence there. So for me, this painting is also quite significant, because he's not many Ukrainian painters depicted Ukraine. So those painters and artists who were allowed to leave Soviet Union during the Soviet times and to travel to Western Europe, to capitalist Europe. They were painting Venice in all these different perspectives. But what is interesting about this piece is that he actually depicts not that much Venice, but people. To me, it's like also a symbolic portrait of this kind of 70s underground community, and he depicts his wife, who was actually present at the Venice Biennial, like literally. Integration into global or Western, in this case, art world. Another objective which Ukrainian community were desperately striving to achieve, and one of the most kind of talked about or written about facts is that two Ukrainian artists, Alexander Roybut, one of them, were presented for the first time, Ukrainian artists in the history of independent Ukraine, I mean, were presented in the main exhibition of the Venice Biennale in the famous legendary show of legendary Harold Zeman, which is something has become an apocrypha of its own. So this this is something which the two artists which were presented at this show, Alexander Roitburt and Viktor Murushenko, were really very eager to tell and tell and tell again. And this is perhaps something which, of course, worth being proud of. And here I'm not criticizing them for being proud of it, of course. But this is, again, the apocrypha, which since then has become like a constant point of return. So every time we need to speak about Ukrainian presence at the international art scene, we try to recollect, oh, we have two artists presented at the famous Harald Zeman show, then it means that we are part of international art scene. But of course, it is not enough. What Ukrainian representation at Venice definitely was lacking for many years is a transparent and established state cultural policy and cultural diplomacy. Now we have Ukrainian Institute who is organizing this beautiful panel discussion, but for many years the cultural diplomacy policy was very unclear and undeveloped and very occasional and sometimes even opportunistic, I dare to say so. And Venice Biennale was also, Ukrainian representation, Venice Biennale was kind of a victim of this untransparency and not clear and not established cultural diplomacy. And sometimes it ended up in very opportunistic decisions and last-minute decision to organize something. And one of the examples, ironically, this is a very transparent pavilion made of glass, organized by Estonian Centre, right on the Fundamenta next to Arsenale. But in fact, this project, I'm not going to kind of stop on the merits of this project itself, but this project was actually a result of a very untransparent actions of the Ministry of Culture, which resulted in 2 curators out of 3 originally appointed to curate the pavilion who withdrew from the organization, and only one left, who was the curator of the Estonian Centre. So in the end, the transparent pavilion actually was kind of a symbol of untransparency and very chaotic actions to organize the national representation. Institutional acknowledgement of the artists. This is something which is a very painful moment for the whole Ukrainian art scene because, well, basically the biggest problem perhaps is that there is no museum of contemporary art. There is no kind of state-funded permanent institutions with permanent collections, and sometimes the Venice Biennale also is kind of treated as the one and only chance to represent yourself on the level that you, as a big artist, big name, is kind of deserve to be represented, and this kind of striving to be represented and this one and only opportunity in a lifetime sometimes leads to, again, another scandals and to some fake protest actions, as it was the case several years ago with after the results of quite actually, maybe for the first time, quite transparently and professionally organized national competition. And the results of it was like heavily and quite brutally and scandalously protested by another candidate to be presented at the Venice Biennale, and which resulted in a kind of, for me, it's been almost like an artistic action of its own with the paid protesters who protested in front of the Ministry of Culture to kind of cancel the competition. But when the journalist actually approached these people and asked, what are you actually protesting of? Do you know what Venice Biennale is? No one of them knew. So it was kind of, yeah, as I said, artistic action on its own. Yeah, so Museum for Contemporary Art, yeah, as I said, is, again, another point of absence, unfortunately, and I couldn't find adaptation to show, of course, one of the most like famous, but at the same time much disputed presentations of a Ukrainian pavilion, which was the very first one, which again was results of the several months of preparations were cancelled 3 months before the opening, and another emergency pavilion, an emergency project was installed, but because there was no time and resources to organize a proper pavilion, the military camp was installed in the Giardini. Of course, now this camp is again looks very relevant because it's a military camp, and now it has a different kind of symbolism, bitter symbolism, while for the past 20 years it was perceived in a more ironic way. But again, this temporality and this kind of temporary, fragile, rough pavilion, the photograph of this tent, I think, is a very illustrative and very speaks a lot about how the Ukrainian presence in Venice was organized in the past years. Trust, or rather lack of trust in curatorial expertise and absence of clear role divisions in organizing is another point of debate and another point of let's say, homework to be done for Ukrainian Pavilion. This is rather an ironic illustration because, of course, Vitaly Klitschko, I'm sorry, was not the famous boxer, was not the real curator behind one of the Ukrainian pavilions. It was rather a very ironic conceptual gesture of the artist Ilya Chichkan, who photographed him and appointed him a curator, which was, to my mind, again, a very ironic but very thoughtful, actually, comment and gesture toward the situation of curatorial institute in Ukraine. And again, yeah, the lack of trust and the lack of develop role division, develop a procedure of how such things as Ukrainian Pavilion is organized. Ukrainian Pavilion Venice has to be organized. It leads to, again, a series of failures in a proper organizing of it. And the last point would be power games. Being, of course, one of the most famous, the biggest, the richest, and one of the indeed most important platforms of contemporary art in the world. The Venice Biennale is a point where power games can be implemented. And this year it was not an exclusion. There was an opening of the National Pavilion of Ukraine, and there was an opening of the Ukrainian project, dedicated to Ukrainian art, organized by Pinchuk Center, and something happened which led to the fact that the President Zelensky, who is now also famous for giving this speeches, recording the speeches and addressing the international audiences on many different visible platforms such as international film festivals, Frankfurt Book Fair, and the Venice Biennale would be, of course, another very important platform to address the international art community, especially in the very beginning of the war, because the April was the second month of the war. But due to some power games, I would put it shortly, Zelensky's speech was broadcasted not as the state-funded national pavilion, but at the private project, which I think also illustrates some kind of system errors in the way how things are organized and how national politics, cultural politics is functioning, what kind of results it brings. So I think this is another point to work on, actually, the homework to be done for the whole community and for the cultural infrastructure, the state infrastructure. Why Venice Biennale? Why am I telling all this, and how does it relate to our topic, the future of the biennials? To my mind, the conclusion I would like to give, and maybe then we can also discuss it in our group, is that perhaps there are too many efforts and too much energy, money, power, ambitions, sometimes being accumulated by artistic community of certain country to be represented in such a big imperial, as we put it here, events as Venice Biennale. And perhaps this ambitions, power, energy, money, etc. Has to first be put into developing its own internal infrastructure, like building the museums and developing a transparent cultural policy. And the result of this transparent cultural policy has to be organization of such things as national representation at Venice, but not vice versa. And I think the systematic error which we as a country are now facing, and again, I'm not here to criticize my own country, especially in the times like that, but what I want to do is to, point to the necessity to maybe reload how we work with our cultural infrastructure and use this chance of tremendous support and of the rethinking of many things that we are now going through in art and culture as well to have a fresh start and organize things which are really important and which are contributing to the real, not just temporary presence of Ukraine on the international map. Because if we invest all our energy into building something temporary, and the Venice Biennale, even if it lasts for 6 months, the longest biennial, I think, from those that exist, it is still a very temporary. 9 months, this year even 9 months, yes. So even in this case, it's something very temporary, something which is being forgotten the next day after it closes doors. But before investing everything we have, and we have to actually look for our inside problems and establish, understand who we are, and establish a very steady platform to speak from in our own country. And yeah, I invite actually everyone before the biennial is here for another week, I think, to visit what we call Emergency Pavilion Piazza Ukraina, organized upon invitation of the Venice Biennale together with the Ukrainian Emergency Art Foundation, which is also another interesting illustration of how things can be done last minute, but in the same time having a very important symbolism. So the same way as this military camp has become a symbol of Ukrainian presence at Venice as something temporary, last minute, the new symbol would be perhaps this beautiful architectural project by Dana Kosmina, who designed it, which represents something very fragile, very symbolic, but not because it was done the last minute or done not professional, but because it was done during the war times, and this is the best that could be done in such circumstances. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm ready for the first questions. We started talking yesterday in the conversation about decoloniality and biennial that probably the national, the structure of the biennials according to the national pavilions doesn't work anymore, especially under the colonial conditions. And we were talking and referring to biennials that kind of work more not on the national basis but with the international issues and international artists. But at the same time, what we could hear today from both Hanna and Lisa, that for Ukrainian context, Venice Biennale was so crucial within 100 years, and it was the kind of a point of a reference for everything that was happening inside, for helping establishing institutions, structures, principles of work for art. So it was a certain driver, a certain point of reference for the things that happened inside. And it was also important in the presentation that Anastasia Platonova did yesterday to kind of legitimize that Ukraine is there. Its voice is heard at this main global international platform, for art. So I see here, a little contradiction. Like we are talking that we don't need the national pavilions, but at the same time we're saying it's so important for us as the country, as Ukraine, to be represented as the national pavilion. And we are, referring to the fact that we don't have our own kind of pavilion. We are striving with the procedure, with the resource, etc., to be represented. How do we solve this contradiction? How do we deal with it? Do we need the pavilion, national pavilion? Do we don't need it?
This works. No, I can start just to kind of follow up what I was telling before. No, I think we need biennial. Why not? What I was also trying to say is that the national representation at the Venice Biennale has to be kind of a result, like the top of the iceberg of some bigger and more important processes inside of the country and of the cultural policy to represent the country internationally. But the problem which I was trying to pinpoint is that sometimes the temptation or kind of the stakes are so high. The Venice Biennale puts so much pressure on the national representation because it's just the biggest and the most famous and the most well-visited biennial. I mean, it's now like the second last week of the biennial. Look at the crowds. I mean, our audience online cannot see them, but today we saw the crowd, so you have to, I don't know, wait for 2 hours to enter the main exhibition. So it's really well visited. Perhaps it's the most well visited exhibition among the general audience as well. So my point is that the Venice Biennale puts so much pressure on those who represent or want to be represented there, that it actually kind of takes the attention away of some other issues and tasks and goals which the artistic community or the government or those in charge for representing the state internationally actually have to also take care of. So my answer would be yes, the biennial has to be there, but perhaps it doesn't have to be treated by the different countries and the institutions responsible for the national representation and as a lifetime chance. And perhaps those in charge for representing different countries in this level has to also be a little bit more critical and a little bit more to try to undermine also how and where they're going to present their country. And in this case, I think this Estonian-Dutch case is brilliant, specifically because it's not just about undermining and being critical and deconstructing about certain narratives of the history of two countries, but also it's kind of critical towards this very notion of the national presence and the kind of solid pavilion which represents the national presence, which is in itself very problematic because only a limited number of countries can be represented in this solid building. So national representation also means that you have a building, you have a construction to represent. I mean, it gives certain privilege and certain visibility to those who were fast enough and established enough. I mean, the countries who build the pavilion, and now it's impossible because there is no land in Giardini to build one more, and other countries has to, you know, find some different solutions. It has to be creative, and again, has to be put maybe efforts to being visible rather than putting efforts into perhaps some other things. So this is like additional tasks, you know, to gain visibility. So again, just to summarize, my answer would be yes, it doesn't mean we have to shut the pavilions, but we have to be really critical and quite careful at how we approach this format, not to glorify it with our own efforts, but rather to undermine it.
Perhaps just to briefly comment, and I can totally synthesize or sign this statement to use the Biennale and the pavilions critically and exactly for decolonizing or deconstructing games would be one of the ways how to come to terms with this controversy, that while we are speaking a lot about the necessity of decolonizing or the necessity of transnational approaches, that we are still doing the art projects in the foreseeable future within the framework of biennales that are organized according to national pavilions. In the case of the Estonian pavilion that this year was located in the historical Dutch pavilion venue, it's also a very transnational project in the sense that the team included Estonians, but also people coming from other parts of the world. The creator was from Romania, and Bita Rasavi, one of the artists, she's originally from Iran. It also had Indonesians, both from Indonesia and from the Netherlands contributing. So I think this is also one of the ways to open up. Or today we visited the Polish pavilion that is dedicated to the Roma culture. So I think this is one of the ways how to handle this. And if I think back about like the history of the Estonian pavilions that we have had since 1999, then I think that the ones that have been most fruitful are the ones who try to address transnational problems, but at the same time also open up new avenues of inquiry in arts and research in Estonia. So I think about, like, for example, Jaanus Sammas Pavilion for some years ago that really opened up discussions around LGBT history and the ways how to explore this in artistic research, but also among historians. And I think also this year's pavilion, the Estonian Pavilion, that really, I would suppose, opens up these discussions, and it already has opened up discussions around colonial history and decolonization in Estonia, and again, both in the arts world, but also among researchers in cultural history, but also the history of knowledge.
I would also agree with colleagues that this national pavilion structure could be that, but its contents could be changed quite radically. And again, this Dutch-Estonian collaboration is a wonderful example of this possibility. Because national history is no longer a history of a certain nation. It's a history very much entangled with multiple histories of many peoples, of many power structures, and to present certain history is to talk about many histories now, and to be self-reflective, like Lizaveta today was very self-reflective and self-critical, talking about Ukrainian Pavilion, Venice Pavilion history. And this is a unique story, which no one but Ukraine can tell to the world. And it is important experience to reflect upon and to share. And why not? We can tell it within the pavilion, we can compare it with other post-colonial, post-Soviet societies, which also probably had or had not some similar experiences. But still, I would suggest that maybe one of the key topics for the future national pavilions would be self-reflecting of history, of power, of coloniality, whether of more a colonized or a colonialist experience, which always would involve other stories, other perspectives, other voices, and so on. And I would like also to point to the Czechoslovakia story, which Lucia had kindly told me during our today's communication. The case when this very colonial Czechoslovakian common pavilion, common resource, common property of the former United States state has been decided in a very harmonious and very non-conflict way between the heirs of the state, Czechia and Slovakia, and they decided to go in turns and to switch their participation, their presentation within Venice Biennale every 2 years, so 2 years for Slovakia, 2 years for Czech Republic. And this kind of sharing of this kind of, I would say, loving relations that could be seen there. Of course, they have many problems, many structural, financial, logistical, whatever problems, as many post-colonial countries of the second world, or the third world, always have participating in such prestige events. But still, I asked her if there are good personal relations between those who are in charge of participating in Venice Pavilion. She said yes, we are colleagues and we communicate harmoniously. we support each other, and we share. And this is something, for me, this is something very new in this often very difficult, very painful, as Lisa showed us, very scandalous, usually scandalous history. So there could be different alternative possibilities to manage national pavilions within Venice Biennale.
No, actually, I was going to add something, but Hanna actually already pinned it that, yeah, again, the very format of National Pavilion can be indeed used for presenting not necessarily like national art, if we dare to use this term, but perhaps art of communities, societies which doesn't have its own presence, its own voice, or its own infrastructure, as in the case of, for example, Sami Pavilion and the Scandinavian Pavilion, which is one of the most beautiful presentations this year, and again, very popular, very well visited, which is great. And perhaps for this kind of deconstructing, decolonizing processes, the Venice Biennale is maybe the perfect platform, because of the contrast of the initial idea of how it was envisioned like 100 years ago, even more, 130 years ago, and the processes which need to be highlighted now. So in this case, perhaps, you know, yeah, to have this contrast, to give a national pavilion, something with this kind of term national, to something which contests the notion of nationality, of a monolithic nationality, is a very actually refreshing and good gesture, good move.
Thank you for pointing out the Sami Pavilion, because yeah, it's also one of those cases that it gives the choice, it gives the perspective. And I also wanted to remind that this year's French Pavilion is also presenting an Algerian artist. So it's basically, you don't even have to have someone from the community in your country, or someone who is like the same nationality or citizenship. It can be outside, it can be some international artist or other type of representation. But I would like to come back to the structure of the La Biennale di Venezia and the question that is raised there. So far, there were some shifts in actually switching the pavilions or inviting like others to present their art, etc. But the actual pavilions do belong to certain states. And it's like the embassy, yeah, like the land and the building belongs to the state, even if it's on the territory of the other country. And this is a legal issue. This is the question of property, yeah, and some kind, and it's protected also by the international law system, etc. Coming back to the issue of the Russian pavilion, which remains empty at the moment, and because of the international sanctions, because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it definitely will remain in such way for at least several years after the invasion is over, before, you know, all the contributions are paid and all the justice is returned. But after that, we can expect, again, Russia being back in the Russian pavilion, doing kind of the same thing. I mean,
doing Russian business.
Well,
Russian biennial business.
I mean, weaponizing art and misusing, etc. But I mean, there are no visible signs of Russia having any intention in terms of decoloniality, at least from the inside. And we know the process is a long one. So I mean, it may take decades for them to kind of, you know, get through. And imagining there will be this continuation of the colonial discourse, and the situation around the Venice Biennale will change, definitely. We already see the signs, and we know that nothing can stop decoloniality if its time is there. So what do you think? What is the future of the Russian pavilion? What can be done? I mean, we don't have to make any kind of a decision, but I mean, we can just imagine the changes and just imagining as a community, you know, as a biennial community, as someone who worked on the pavilions, curated, commissioned, researched for that, that's part of the field that we are working in. And at some point we will need, you know, also have the answer to this question. So what are your thoughts?
I can start. When we were on our way to Venice as a team of the current Ukrainian Pavilion Venice when we were on our way from Ukraine here, and when we could, when we were ready to make a statement that yes, the Ukrainian Pavilion will be opened, we'll bring the fountain, it's happening. We were like all of us, like the artists, 3 curators, perhaps some other members of the team. We were approached like privately via Facebook in private chats by many people from art community saying like, we have to take back the Russian pavilion. We have to organize. So there was even like ideas of like, let's bring the fountain to Russian pavilion. Let's just kind of take it over, and this would be the gesture of justice, of actually, reclaiming something which is yours because it was founded by Khanenko family, and so on and so forth. Then I received many creative ideas from different also artists of what can be done there, what kind of, again, artistic gestures can be done there, but because these artists, specifically male artists, could not travel outside of Ukraine during the war and could not come and do it, they were offering to do it, perhaps I kind of commissioning us to do it, or just found a way to do it. So there was like lots of immediate ideas of what can be done with the pavilion, but my position, and I think we share it in the current team of Ukrainian Pavilion, that we don't have to, at least we don't have to do it like immediately to kind of claim it back. It's not that, it's not our policy, it's not our strategy to hijack something, to invade something. We're not using the rhetorics and the methods of the invader's country. I cannot propose you anything like a ready decision. I'm kind of up for, but I think the destiny of this pavilion, the destiny of the country that brought so much devastation, can be a good point to rethink maybe this whole frame of this national belonging, of the belonging to the property, which kind of breaks any other, which breaks any other logic and any other moral logic. So yeah, kind of from moral point of view, this building can be taken away from the country, the same as private funds or some properties are now being reclaimed, not reclaimed, but just taken from the Russian owners in, I don't know, Switzerland and other countries. So the same can be done with the pavilion. So from kind of artistic point of view, from the logic of the from the biennial, this building perhaps can be reclaimed and can just belong to the biennial itself, and it can be used for some other purposes, to be given to Ukraine, to be given to other country, to be used as a space for, I don't know, any other special projects. I don't want to kind of fantasize what it could be done now, but because there is this law which you cannot, because it belongs as an embassy, it belongs to the other country, you cannot do it. And this is in a way a little bit ridiculous, because the biennial is a place of, it's supposed to be a place of artistic freedom, it's supposed to be a place of unlimited possibilities of thought, of thinking, but then what can you done if there is just a law, which, and there is the carabinieri can come and arrest you if you will try to do any artistic intervention into the building, and you can be blamed for vandalize it, but can you vandalize something which belongs to the biggest vandalizer, the state in the world right now? So this is like jurisdictional kind of contradiction. So I don't know, like my position that this building has to be taken away from Russian state, and it might be again a good starting point, maybe too brutal to kind of with a too high price to pay behind it, but it can be actually a starting point of rethinking this ownership of the buildings which were built and paid sometimes 100 years ago, and the whole international policy has changed since that. Even if the country has the same name, it's a different country with different politics, and there is a different perspective of many things. So can we actually claim, can we still kind of allocate something which was created 100 years ago to the same country, to the same owners, without rethinking actually the legacy? So.
I totally agree that it might and should, the pavilion, I mean, be a part of repatriations and a part of compensation, as well as embassies and other property of Russia. And for me, it is very important that such institutions like Venice Biennale and other big players on the cultural and political scenes make a clear statement, not just helping Ukrainian artists, fostering Ukrainian presence, but make louder statements on the Ukrainian theme and on the Russian theme. It seems to me that it's an important and it's critical part of decolonizing the Biennial. It's a very eloquent case when its stance of being open and intentions to decolonize, for decolonization, could be shown. But after that happens, I think it must happen sooner or later, that Russian property would be seized and compensated to Ukraine. It's a very interesting and it's a difficult question, of course, to choose what to do with this property, because as the history has shown, Pavilion was a price Ukrainian culture paid to the empire, and the same history tells that it was a very compromised project of all the participants. No one were totally satisfied with its architecture. It was very compromised, was very scandalous. Also the process of its erecting and furnishing, and Joseph himself was not really satisfied. So it's very traumatic experience for culture, and it's very traumatic example of traumatized colonialism, traumatized culture, and it should be reconceptualized as such. And it is a very interesting thing to do. And for me, I just sitting here, I imagine that there may be something bigger built around it and under it, because Russian Pavilion was in fact a very small thing, a very small part in the bigger history of Ukrainian unfolding of Ukrainian culture, of Ukrainian agency, of Ukrainian subjectivity, of its power, which was many times repressed, suppressed again and again. It evolved and started unfolding again. So it could be something just not touching it, but changing the environment, the surrounding of it. So to explain and discuss its real significance, real content. It would be a very interesting thing to do.
What can I add here? Perhaps that until these developments happen, I think also this year the way that the Russian Pavilion was standing just lonely and empty and abandoned, that I think also had a very strong symbolic meaning and significance. So I wouldn't underestimate that also, this state of emptiness, abandonness in this otherwise very, as we also saw today, in this very vibrant, crowded area of the Biennale. I think that's significant too. And I think also even before it's possible to reclaim or conquer the pavilion itself, also different kinds of interventions can happen. We were just today talking about the 2008 Architecture Biennale, when the Estonians didn't have a pavilion in Giardini, but the Estonian architects built a gas pipeline from the Russian pavilion leading to the German pavilion. So you don't always have to intervene into the physical space of the pavilions themselves to make a powerful statement. That was still the time that the Nord Stream pipeline was under construction. It wasn't even finished at that time. So yeah, there are different options, and I think it's also really relevant to, as you also hinted at, to deal with the history of Russian colonialism, which I would very much like to hope to be more visible in the biennales and in the international exhibitions, museums across the globe. And again, I think it would be very fascinating, useful, and decolonizing if it would be written, namely from the perspective of different Eastern European countries, not starting from Russia, from the big centers of Russia, but rather from different Eastern European countries that have similar, but also at the same time different experiences with Russian colonialism, imperialism.
And also Central Asian, Caucasus, etc. So because Russia is the huge nation actually entering in different regions. Thank you so much. Well, yeah, I don't envy the office and the administration of La Biennale di Venezia that they have to deal with this question. And I mean, it's quite an urgent issue, because if you don't take care of the premises of the building, it will eventually decay, as it happens with time. So we'll see how it, might fall apart in front of our eyes, because there can be no legal solution for this situation, and if the empire doesn't deconstruct itself, doesn't decolonize itself, it might just ruin everything that kind of belongs to it, together with itself. But I don't want to kind of get into pessimism, and I would like to involve the audience into our conversation. I already see the hand, and could we please ask a little bit of light to the audience? Thank you. And please only speak when you have the microphone, otherwise we'll not be able to hear you.
Hi, I'm Francesca Valentini, an art historian, researcher, and educator who has been trying to study, research, and communicate the history of the Venice Biennale since 2007. Thank you so much for this lecture and very inspiring conversation that actually confirm us, I guess, the importance, this political, social, and economical relevance of the Venice Biennale, which is a very complex institution for which I don't work for, so I'm not representing the Venice Biennale at all. I have plenty of questions, but I would restrain myself to a very pragmatic one. Could you expand a little bit or explain us a little bit better how happened and how were you able to organize the switch, also maybe with a few economical details between the Estonian and the Netherlands pavilion?
Yes, so it was, the initiative came from the Dutch, who wanted to switch the pavilion. And due to the good relations, I think, because I wasn't part of that administrative team dealing with the switch, but due to the good relations between the teams behind the Netherlands pavilion and the Estonian pavilion, Estonia was chosen. It was only after that we had an open call in Estonia for different artistic projects, and so it happened that the project that has had these direct links to Dutch colonial history won the competition. But obviously Estonia itself couldn't have afforded a place in these central locations, either in Giardini, where the national pavilions are, or then in Arsenale, but the Estonian pavilion has been located in different more remote regions across the city due to budget limitations. But I think then these kind of the Dutch initiative to switch the pavilions came namely from realizing these limitations that the more privileged and the less privileged countries have, and as a gesture from their side to offer their utmost central location to one of those countries that due to historical and economic reasons do not have the chances to exhibit their projects so centrally otherwise. So the Dutch pavilion this year was located in a more far-off location.
May I just, I don't know, put this question into more details? So basically the Dutch pavilion provided you their space and they had to rent out another location to have their own pavilion.
Yes.
Okay, that's a good deal for Estonia. Thank you. We can have still, I think, one other question or comment. So please raise your hand. One second, yeah, the mic is coming.
Yes, thank you very much for your lecture, Hanna, and also for the discussion. I have a question which maybe you mentioned and I didn't get it clearly, but because you showed us how much Khanenko has invested in some also self-determination of the Ukrainians and with his museum, his collection, and how could that happen then, that founding the Russian pavilion, this Ukrainian question somehow didn't appear, or was there any discussion that could be potentially also Ukrainian pavilion and Russian pavilion, in the Russian pavilion? How did it happen that this Ukrainian question didn't was not on the agenda while founding the Russian pavilion?
Thank you for the question. There was no such discussion in the Khanenko's times. Ukrainian painters participated in Venice projects in Russian pavilion on the Venice Biennale. And Khanenko himself, as I said, they both were not interested in modern art. Tereshchenkos were, and they they patronized artists and helped them and made commissions and collected the art, Ukrainian artists and Russian artists. But both of these families, the Khanenkos and the Tereshchenkos, were not thinking about, as I am, as researchers so far I know, they were not thinking about Ukraine as separate state. They were thinking of Ukraine and of Kyiv as a center of culture, as Paris, as Berlin. They wanted their homeland and their home city to become a European, a big city, grand city. But not only in terms of elite culture, but also they did so much, which I had no time to tell about, and it's a different story, in terms of education and social infrastructure in Kyiv and other states, everywhere where they can reach, where they had time and resource to reach, to help, to develop, to bring modernity to these areas of human civilization. But they were not thinking and planning Ukrainian independence. So they were not against when Bogdan had already died and Varvara remained alone, a widow, and the Ukrainian revolution started in Kyiv. She was very frightened with all these processes because they were aristocrats and they were used to these certain social structures, very vertical, and they did what they could do within these social structures. But she was clever and sensitive enough to support Ukrainian intellectuals when they founded Ukrainian Academy of Arts and Ukrainian Academy of Science. She collaborated. They still, she was a part of this community of people. And when Bolsheviks came, she was so focused. She was 67 by then, or 68, but she was so focused on the idea of the museum, of this, her target, ultimate sense that she had to implement, that she had adjusted for Bolshevik decisions to nationalize the museum, the house and the collection, and to establish Soviet then state museum. It was called Second State Museum in Kyiv in 1919. She collaborated with them. She helped them to, she was a curator, in fact, with George Lukomsky, whom she invited, an art historian. Two of them, there were two people who made first exhibitions, first labels, first guided tours, and she supported museum financially and organizationally until her death in 2022. And by that time she was, again, it was a committee, an academic committee of the museum. She was its honorary member. So it was such a difficult times she lived through, and she understood she cannot change anything in politics. She just tried to keep this idea and this project alive and sustainable for future. So there was no specific Ukrainian independence ambition of the Khanenkos. They were people of their time, and for them it was not the case. For them the case was independence and sustainability and power of culture here on Ukrainian land. But they were the people who actually founded cultural heritage of Ukraine, meaning archaeology, world art, history, books, collections, a lot of things that were actually founders of. So that's a real story. You cannot make it, simpler than it was.
Yeah, it's oftentimes difficult for us to understand that the conditions and the assumptions of a situation more than 100 ago were like so absolutely different from what we have now, and how much actually we have achieved in these 100 years as the culture, as the state, as the artistic community, I would say. Yeah. So back then, I'm sure there was not a question because there was lack of infrastructure. By 1914, there was just this one art college. There were no art academies, so people couldn't even get educated in art within Ukraine. So there was only first museum in Kyiv, and so kind of it was not established artistic scene that would imagine exporting something. There was the question of actually having an infrastructure within the country that would kind of produce and work for the inner audience and for the inner reasons and meanings. I just wanted to also share my thoughts on this. Yeah, sure.
In this sense, Varvara Khanenko did something which I was criticizing our artistic community for the past 20 years that we haven't done. So she established something which lasted, and it lasts till today. So it was about the building the inner infrastructure, and I'm totally here with you that of course it's complicated to judge to try to kind of step into the shoes of someone who lived 100 years ago in a completely different historical circumstances. So I think here we should judge about what have been done rather than what haven't been done, but to our mind could have been done, you know, as of kind of claiming like more independence for Ukrainian culture. But it's obvious that what was done, what have been done, has a tremendous impact until today.
And the pavilion in the Russian pavilion in Venice was the prize to have the first sustainable institution within Ukraine. So there is a connection.
Two sustainable Ukrainian content museum, public museum of Ukrainian history, and world art museum actually. And I would also like to add that, as I said, the second half of the last decades of the 19th century was very hard for Ukrainian intellectual elite. They couldn't speak publicly, couldn't publish anything in Ukrainian. It was just banned. It started from banning the school books, school manuals for school children in Ukrainian, but then in 1876, it was this this decree that banned Ukrainian theater, Ukrainian book printed. All kinds of books in Ukrainian were banned by Russian Empire. The empire was so afraid of that Polish events and Polish Młoda Polska and all this Polish separatist movement. They just didn't allow anything Ukrainian, anything that could evolve into any kind of Ukrainian separatism. So Khanenko could probably, it was useless to even think of something like Ukrainian pavilion, separate pavilion in Biennale. It was not the issue then. They did what they could, what he actually bought in his very rational this exchange with the empire, what he could do then. And it was institution, which lasted until today and will last long, I think.
Yeah, but the Ukrainian pavilion is the issue now, and the issue, I think, is being optimistically solved. And with this, I would like to wrap up and finish this this particular conference, this particular talk, and also the whole public program of the Ukrainian Pavilion at the 59th Biennale di Venezia. It's a little bit sad, but I think it's also a long way that we have gone through these 8 months, and I would like to thank all the 40 participants, the speakers, the moderators of this program that gave its time and effort to contribute and to talk and discuss about the decoloniality in the context of the Russian invasion of the war and the future of the art and the biennial. I would like to thank all the 10 institutions that hosted us, that supported us, that helped to bring the outstanding speakers to this stage. And we have now more than 25 hours of recorded discussions and lectures that will be available online for as long as there is internet, so you can view it endlessly and go back and pick up on the things that you might lost. And we already have more than 10,000 viewers watching these videos, and the number is growing as I speak. And I would like to thank, again, all the partners of this particular program, and it's the House of Europe, the International Renaissance Foundation, Open Place NGO, the Gallery Naked Room, and the team of the Ukrainian Pavilion at the 59th Biennale, the Ministry of Culture of Ukraine, the Ministry of Culture of Estonia, and the Centre of Contemporary Art in Estonia. And I would like to thank La Biennale di Venezia for hosting this whole program and welcoming us at Teatro Piccolo Arsenale, this wonderful location. And thank you all the staff and all the technical guys and girls for helping us arrange this wonderful time in Venice throughout the duration of the Venice Biennale. And I just wanted to remind you that we started this in April by thinking together with the historians and artists and art managers about how the Russian invasion changed the art world. And it was the opening days of the Biennial, and we could already see that everything has changed. Many, many questions were then still open, but everyone could feel the difference and the shift that was there in the international historical scenery, and of course affecting the artistic community as well. And we spoke in September here about the issue of decoloniality as such, and how it changed and how it affects the art community and the international structures, the infrastructure of art. We talked about weaponizing art, and we talked about art being a target at wars and the losses of art and the misuse of culture for actually aggressive and violent actions. The previous event, the previous conference had to deal with the histories that are missing in the art history narrative, and the main art history being also an imperial approach, because there definitely have to be multiple stories, multiple histories, and we have to find the ways to pick up those things that are falling between the cracks to shed light over something that was in the shadow. And we spent the past few days talking about the imperial legacy behind the pavilions, behind the biennials, and we spoke about the future of the pavilions, even if they are not national pavilions any longer. Of course, there is no opportunity. We cannot solve all the issues and questions, but I think we raised enough of issues that are common in between ourselves, and we started finding some solutions and some paths. One of the things that we came up with in this last conference, I think, is that the voice of the Eastern Europe hasn't been heard enough, and there are stories that might be told from our part of the world, for sure, and there are many answers that lay in the shadows of the histories that are in our region. And as you might notice, we have all these fantastic speakers, this conference, mostly from the Eastern Europe. So I do hope that we were able to help international community to find some interesting solutions and interesting questions. Thank you, all the audience, both online and in person in Venice, for staying with us, for giving your wonderful questions, posing your wonderful questions and being with us. And with this, I'm saying goodbye. I do hope we can come back to this conversation in the other occasion, hopefully the Architecture Biennial next year, because the biennials don't end, they continue every year, and there is another one coming. And thank you all, keep safe, and Slava Ukraini.